I'm Shahar Azani, and welcome to this episode of Eye on Israel, taking a deeper look into Iran, the Gulf, and regional developments in the greater Middle East. As news and rumors come and go about the potential nuclear agreement between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the United States, one truth remains unchanged: the negative role Iran plays internally, regionally, and globally. Even now, almost 1 year after 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was murdered at the hands of Iran's so-called morality police, protests across the country calling for the rights of women and girls persist. All the while, the regime has detained and tortured tens of thousands of protesters, killing hundreds. As it battles its own citizens, the Iranian regime continues to work to destabilize and undermine other countries in the region while financing and fueling Palestinian terror against innocent Israelis. What is next for the region? Will there be an agreement between the US and Iran? Is there? And will we reach a Saudi-Israeli normalization? So many questions in need of an answer. With me is the perfect person for the task of unraveling the mysteries of the Middle East. Right here at our JBS studios in New York's Times Square is our good friend, Dr. Eric Mandel. Dr. Mandel is the director of MEPIN, the Middle East Political Information Network. He regularly briefs members of Congress and their foreign policy aides. He is the senior security editor for the Jerusalem Report and is a regular contributor to The Hill and the Jerusalem Post. He speaks at universities and for organizations, most recently at Yale and Columbia, as well as for federations and leading Jewish organizations all across the country and the world. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
And I have one new thing to tell you.
Tell me.
Something called Mandel Strategies, where we're now going to expand into helping nations in the Middle East and the United States work together, work economically together, help investors have more perspectives, and really leads to what I really want to do, which is help advance American national security interests, right, Israeli national security interests, and really the security interests of the whole region to be more stable. Right. And the best way to do that is economically empowering everyone so they have a reason not to be angry at one another.
Right. So you've been doing this for a long time. Like, I've known you for years. You've been present at the scene, at the very highest level, highest echelons of government here in the United States, in Israel, and across the region. And it's exactly that kind of expertise and information that I would love to tap into with you today for the sake of our viewers, because this is a very confusing region and extremely confusing circumstances.
What you really hit upon is this is a five-dimensional chess area. And unfortunately, we in America look through Western eyes, right, and we're playing not playing chess or five-dimensional chess. We're playing checkers,
right,
because and the region continually changes. The interests continually change, and because sometimes my friend is my friend, sometimes my friend is my enemy, and it's just we have to look through different eyes and also a different timeline. When we here in the West, we want to have things done in nanoseconds,
right,
weeks, months, maybe. There, if I was listening to, I'm going to be speaking to Turkish government next week and Turkish business people, and I was listening to a speech of Erdogan referring to something from 700 years ago, and everybody got it. Can you imagine him here in the United States? First of all, we weren't here 700 years ago, but
right,
2010, 1990 is ancient history.
Right.
We need to have a more open, wider view of the world.
It's true. The operative word in Arabic, which, growing up in Israel, you keep on hearing is sabr. Sabr, which means patience. And I'll never forget one of the statements made by Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad, who is the father of the current Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. And when he was asked about Israel, he said, well, I'm not really concerned because even the Crusaders were here for, a couple hundred years. They did what they did and they went away, just like the state of Israel is here and it'll go away, because they look at it, like you say, in perspective of centuries, not minutes, not months, definitely not a term. And speaking about the term, I want to dive into the issues with you and ask you about those rumors circling about the Biden administration unfreezing $6 billion USD back to the Iranian regime in exchange for the release of American citizens. What's happening there?
So despite the protest that this is not sanctions relief by Secretary of State Blinken and the President, that's how it's perceived. There may be some technicalities that it's not, quote, sanctions relief, but these were sanctioned funds by the last administration. And what it was $6 billion in frozen sanctioned monies that was sitting in South Korea.
South Korea.
And so now, basically, it's $1.5 billion hostage payment, and that's how it's perceived there. Whether that's technically true or not doesn't make a difference. Now, the next shoe to drop is the United States may give Iraq permission.
Wait. First of all, is that a done deal? Is the U.S. paying that money?
It will be. They're doing it in stages. They're doing it behind the scenes. They're doing it out of the eyes of Congress. I know Congress is, it's so partisan, but if you're on the Democratic side and against this, you're not really wanting to talk about it. If you're on the Republican side, you use it as talking points. What I do in Congress is I say, I don't care about your Democrat or Republican. I work on both sides of the aisle. What is good for American national security interests and our allies there? Is this good for us? And not the way it's being done.
When you're saying, is this good for us, it kind of baffles me to think that the U.S. would pay so much money for the release of a few hostages. Is there more behind this? Is this part of a greater understanding between the U.S. and Iran, even touching upon the nuclear issue and beyond?
So first of all, we released during the Obama administration, I think it was 2016, we paid, I think, $4 billion for 4 hostages. Right. So this is not unprecedented. But what you're really asking is a much more complex issue. What does the president want to do? The president would like to do a less for less or a freeze for freeze deal to kick the can down past the 2024 elections. So there's a political component in there. We are not going to stop Iran from having the ability to enrich to 90%. Right. We do not have the ability to stop them from delivering nuclear material in weapons. Those ships have sailed. The only thing that we can do is stop their weaponization. And what that means is we're allowing it to go on without protest, is we're allowing them to turn enriched uranium gas into a metal, which is a big part of the weaponization process, where you compartmentalize the material on top of a nuclear warhead. So what's going on here in the multi-layers is, I believe that Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, they're talking to the Saudis, and because the Saudis, no matter what, even with the Iranian rapprochement, they are not going to be rivals. This is a common interest. It's all because they perceive the United States has abandoned the region. That's a perception, although I've spoken to the American ambassador in Qatar, the chargé d'affaires in Oman. I've spoken to Israeli foreign ministry people. The perception is the Americans are leaving. When we leave a vacuum. It's being filled by the Russians and Chinese. So the Biden administration has made a decision to get back involved somehow. What it'd like to do is to create a normalization between Israel and the Saudis. It would like to be able to help the Palestinian issue.
These are all, each issue is a quagmire unto itself. But I want to still push on that point of the $6 billion.
Okay.
What is the incentive for the Biden administration to release so much money into the hands of the Iranian regime at a time when we can see what's happening internally in Iran vis-a-vis their own citizens? We mentioned Mahsa Amini at the beginning, at the opening of the show. We are seeing Iran's negative role in trying to destabilize some of America's allies in the Middle East. We're seeing the support for terror organizations. We're seeing what's happening in Yemen. Why would the U.S. release so much money that could be used for these goals of undermining U.S. interests in the region? $6 billion is a lot of money.
$6 billion, and as I say, there'll probably be some more that will be away from the eyes. This is all about, just as I said before, kicking the can down the road. This is not a peace deal. This is not going back to the JCPOA. Right. This is simply about delaying things during this time the administration is in power. And that delay is important to them. And they can rationalize that, saying, well, those were Iranian funds, but they were sanctioned funds. You mentioned the Iranian activists there. I work with Iranian activists who work with the Iranian protesters, and I've written 5 articles about it. Right. And I'm so glad you brought it up, because we in America have forgotten about these people.
Right.
The Iranian people, if given the chance, if we really want to solve this problem, the Iranian people, if given the chance, would not want this 12 Shiism revolutionary ideology to mark them, and what has gone on with tens of thousands of people arrested, many killed, raped, horrible things have been done to intimidate them. What America's policy is, and we don't say it, and we should say it, is we would like to have regime change. That does not mean boots on the ground. What it really means is, and there's actually a study from the Kennedy School of Government, which shows that most regime change takes only 3.5% of the population. We should be supporting the Iranian people. That's how we're going to solve this problem. It's not going to be a military kinetic, if Israel decides to strike on its own or America decides to help. What really needs is we need to empower the Iranian people to have a non-kinetic, to have a uprising, to give them control of their country. That would reorder the Middle East.
It takes me back, Eric, to the Green Revolution and the time when there was an attempt by the people to rise, and it was not met by enthusiasm from the US administration at the time. And even now, what would these masses think, Eric, when they look behind their backs to see the Basij, the terrible Iranian paramilitary police, beating at them, chasing at them, and then the West is granting this regime this incredible financial incentive to embolden it, to strengthen its tentacles all across the region. This is incredibly disheartening for the ordinary Iranian looking and seeing all of this, betrayal by the West.
Right. Listen, I believe in, sometimes we have to follow our interests, but a value-based foreign policy in the long run is respected around the world. And when we don't stand with people standing up against the world's leading state sponsor of terror, the message around the world is America is not that different than China or Russia.
But doesn't the value equal our interest when it comes to Iran? Because taking Iran's irresponsible behavior across the world, taking Iran's direct threat against American interests, because undermining the moderate Middle Eastern regime is undermining American interests. So the value should be equal to the policy. It's not just, the value and the interest go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we are perceived not to be there. That's why the Saudis have reached out to the Iranians through Chinese mediation, our number one adversary in the world.
Right.
So that is that's what's being constructed here. But remember, we change governments every 4 years. So when that part of the world looks at us, they say, what's going to be with the next administration or the next Congress? That's almost why it's easier for authoritarians in the Middle East to deal with Russia or China, because Xi is going to be there, Putin likely is going to be there, and then they know their promises are going to be, it's one person who will make that decision. Here, it is so many people that are involved in that decision, and when an administration changes, it becomes incredibly important. So our transitions are very bumpy, and it makes our allies in the region much more uncomfortable. But the message you said, it's the wrong message. The message is, if we believe in human rights, then we, like we talked about the Green Revolution, which goes specifically to what the Obama administration was looking about, which was to create the environment for respect with Iran to develop a nuclear deal. So they looked past the Green Revolution, where millions of Iranians were in the streets. That could have been what changed the Middle East going forward. It was a major mistake not being with the Iranian people then, a major mistake not being with them in 2017, 2019, and again in 2022. And that's not what America is about.
Beyond the fact that it's terribly depressing to see, the acquiescence of the West to the existence of Iran in this capacity as a great destabilizer and underminer of human rights, of interests, of security, of so many people around the world. Another thing comes to mind, Iran's negative role in the war in Ukraine, when they're actually testing drones made in Iran under Russian control against innocent Ukrainians. I mean, you can't underestimate the negative role that Iran plays today. Do you think, again, that the $6 billion is tied into a tacit understanding between the US and Iran on the nuclear issue?
Well, it's definitely tied to an understanding not to attack our soldiers in places like Al-Tanf, which is a place where precision-guided missiles go through, or attack our soldiers up where we have Kurdish allies in the northwest the northeast of Syria, Kurdish Syrians. So there is definitely those understandings. There's also an understanding that there's some indications that they are going to decrease their enrichment numbers under 60%. But what people have to realize is that once you get to 60%, getting to 90% enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon is an easy step. They already have the knowledge that's not going away. So one of the things we really have to ask in a little deeper way is America's totally focused on their nuclear ambitions, incredibly important.
Right.
But we've put aside the hegemonic expansionism
Right.
that's threatening and undermining our allies across the region.
Right.
And we have
U.S. interests.
And U.S. interests. Again, American interests, we're a war-weary nation. We look at Afghanistan, we look at Iraq, we say we don't want to put American soldiers in harm's way. We make ourselves more vulnerable and the chance of putting our soldiers in harm's way much higher when we disengage, when we create vacuums,
Right.
which the Russians and Chinese have done at this point. If we leave, we get an amazing leverage with a small footprint and actually with the foreign aid that we give. We need to leverage that, but American people misunderstand the importance of that, the importance of the Middle East, the three chokehold places that 40% of the world's fossil fuels transport,
Right.
Hormuz, Bab el-Mandab, Suez Canal. That would, even if we were energy independent, that would cause an economic depression in the world if Iran decided to close off at least one of those areas, and they can. So we need to step back and do what's best for American interests, best for our allies' interests, and best for the world, and look at it on multi-layers of what's there. And empowering the Ayatollah and his henchmen, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, is not in American national security
Right.
interests.
And I go back to the point you mentioned before, it's also the wrong thing to do.
Right? There's values. We
There are
have
values.
values as Americans.
Right, and even in past negotiations, this negative Iranian role, let's look at Lebanon, for instance, a completely failed state at the moment at the hands and the stranglehold of Hezbollah, the terrorist Shiite organization on the northern border with Israel. I mean, again, you can't underestimate the negative role that Iran plays in this regard. Are these points not even mentioned in any kind of discussions with the Iranians? Their treatment of their own citizens, their support for terrorist organizations, their involvement in South America drug trade, their support of Hezbollah, their support of the Houthis. None of it is even mentioned. The focus only remains on the nuclear issue, and that's it.
That's basically what's happened. What you mentioned, something incredibly important. We're so worried about the opioid crisis, but the Hezbollah, it makes billions of dollars
Right.
through the transport from South America of hard narcotics. I actually had this conversation with a Democratic Senate office, and I said, you guys care about what's going on with fentanyl and all these other things. I said, of
Right.
course. I said, then why aren't you furious about this triangle region in South America where Hezbollah is embedded and money launders with the drug cartels? And they said, we didn't know about that. The point here is these are bad guys who will do just about anything despite claiming that they have a religious edict to what they do.
Right.
That's not to diminish anything about Islam. It's what they have done to facilitate that, and they have a macro view of the world. The Iranians want to control the Middle East.
Right.
They wanted to be able to control the Sunnis, even though the Shiites are only 15%.
Right.
And then they really want to go and diminish the United States. And so these things are incredibly important. There's values and there's security interests, and we are not doing ourselves any favors looking past what they are. So, I'm sorry.
Nobody speaks about this enough. We mentioned the silence of U.S. media vis-a-vis the protesters in Iran, which is quite terrible because it's all about the importance to awaken people's consciences. I'm happy we're able to do it here at JBS, and there is so much more I want to touch upon with you as you're here, because you're a man on a mission, Eric. You're a man on a mission to enlighten public discourse on these super crucial issues that at the end of the day touch each and every one of us pockets. This touches our lives directly, whether it's through the drug trade or the cost of gas that we're going to pump into our cars. At the end of the day, whatever we do here as a value base touches upon the interests of each and every one of us as people, as citizens, as human beings. Where does such an understanding between the U.S. and Iran leave Israel?
So, again, this gets back to our original question. Is the United States saying, leave us alone with Iran, And we're going to help normalize, not necessarily join the Abraham Accords, but normalize Israel's relations with Saudi Arabia, or at least the path to normalization. And it's interesting, Israel's number one, despite the judicial protests and all these things, Israel's number one security threat is Iran, nuclear, Iran's expansionism into Syria, which it controls, Iraq,
support of terror,
Lebanon. They have their eyes on Jordan, encircling Israel. They are causing the violence now in the West Bank. We know what they do with Hamas and PIJ in Gaza.
PIJ,
Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which works with Hamas, which unfortunately works with some elements of the Palestinian Authority, which they fight for one another to be who has killed more Israeli soldiers than Israeli civilians. And so we're maybe on a I don't want to mention it yet, but a verge maybe of another intifada of what's going on there. So Iran's duplicity, that they feel that they can basically use what's called dissimulation, basically lying for a greater cause. There's a religious edict from how they misinterpret, I believe, what really is supposed to be there. So Iran is a danger to Israel. Israel should not normalize with Saudi Arabia for allowing Iran to get to a point where it endangers them. Israel could normalize with Saudi Arabia for concessions to the Palestinians or concessions to the Biden administration on progressing judicial reform that breaks apart.
Before we touch upon Saudi Arabia and Israel normalization, which is the next topic I wanted to raise before you, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and I want to ask you about what we've heard recently about the ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It seems that the Saudi regime is trying to soften its approach vis-a-vis the Iranian regime. We heard about, reopening embassies. Where do we stand on that? Are they really softening their approach vis-a-vis Iran? And why are they doing that?
Maybe the best way is I was invited to speak to two of the three most recent ambassadors from Saudi Arabia to Iran when they did have relations. They have a whole think tank all about Iran. They're fixated. The Saudis. This is about interests. It's not about anything beyond that. It's partly because America has left, and so they feel that they need to do this. They're trying to have things quiet. They think it's in their interest, or definitely an Iranian interest. The Chinese were more than happy to facilitate what's going on between the
They mentioned the Chinese mediation.
The Chinese mediation, and that all pokes a finger in the American eye of what's there. So the Saudis and the Iranians will remain rivals. We'll call this Islam 101, Shiite v. Sunni. They are not going to become best friends here. But for the time being, they share interests. And so the Saudis are there at that point. The Saudis, I'm so concerned. And by the way, just to tell you, to back this up, it's just not my opinion. When I spoke to the Qataris, the Omanis, when I spoke in Dubai, when I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Ministry that works here, nobody believes that this rapprochement is a long-lasting. It is a temporary thing that's going on. It works in their interests, but it took America by surprise. And I think that woke up the Biden administration that they can't be totally hands-off of this region. Because remember, what's America's number one adversary? China. And our interest on foreign affairs is consumed with that and Ukraine. They don't have time to think about the Middle East. But
you already tied both of them to the Middle East, whether it's Iran's involvement in the war in the Ukraine, or whether it's Chinese mediation trying to overshadow the U.S. presence, or, as you say, the abandonment of the Middle East by the U.S. So it's all intertwined, Eric.
I'll give you one other thing. The JCPOA, going back, the Europeans were always very much for it.
Right, the original agreement.
The original, but this year, when they were trying to push the Iranians to go back into the agreement, the head EU delegate negotiator, when they found out from Israeli intelligence that it was Iranian drones that were being sent to Russia to attack Ukraine, that slowed down the process. So these things, Iran and Ukraine and China and United States and Israel, they are not separate spheres. They are all intertwined. So the whole idea, it was Israeli intelligence, which America now relies on so much because we lost all of our human intelligence when we left Afghanistan. it was Israeli intelligence that found that it was Iranians that were making the drones for Russia. By the way, one of the things that's happening now is that what's getting it, I just want to tie this in a little bit more with just for Ukraine, is that we have like Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles are being retro-engineered in Iran, sent by the Russians, captured from Ukraine, sent back there so they can use them again have Iran use them against Israel or whoever. That's one of the reasons Israel never sent its Iron Dome there, because they were afraid it would be captured, retro-engineered, and Israel's defenses would fall apart. All of these things, all these spheres are on a macro level really intertwined. If you look at them separately, you'll have terrible foreign policy.
Right. So the other message that I'm hearing for you is the importance of all of us to educate ourselves a little more about what's happening there, because the fact that it's out of sight should not mean for it to be out of mind.
So most Americans are not really interested in pocketbook issues. In fact, American Jews are not that interested about Israel, but everybody should be interested, because these things that happen in foreign affairs affect economics. And affect who and what we are and what we want to be. And we really can come together on many of these issues. Just going back, we should be coming together against the Iranian regime and their brutal treatment of their people.
Their people. You know, we go back to that point. You know, it's clear cut. When you look at Iran, try to, you know, simplify the whole thing and look at the very basic foundation of the evil nature of this regime and its treatment of its own people and its inhumane ways in which it's treating its future generation. And that alone should enrage each and every one of us. I know it enrages me. You mentioned American, you mentioned Jews. You visit the region often. I want to ask you on a personal note. You know, you visited Saudi Arabia recently. You visited other countries in the region. How was that for you? Like, how was it interacting with, you know, Saudi officials, interacting with ordinary Saudis, visiting the region as an American, as a Jew, as Dr. Eric Mandel?
From my experience in Saudi Arabia, it could not have been more welcoming. That was a trip I did alone, and when I would meet with the Saudi security people, there was 20 people in the room of high officials talking to me. When I met with foreign ministry people, defense people, they could not have been more welcoming. I did not feel anti-Semitism, and sometimes I pinched myself and I said,
right.
You know, can you imagine this have happened 6 years ago, before the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, was there? There's a revolution. I had a guide, somebody who was taking me, a driver, and he says, you can't believe it. We were there, we saw women in Riyadh. Now granted, in the hinterlands there's going to be more conservative, but we saw women dining together. We saw women driving. We saw women without hijabs on at night. It was amazing, and I was going any place I wanted. I was not being brought to places. Yes, this is a very conservative society, and they are the custodians of the holy places of Islam. They have to go slower in what they do because they feel they're the leaders of Islam in the world, which is why they're a little more hesitant about normalization with Israel, because they feel they have a bigger role to play. But as an American, I could not have felt more welcome, but they did feel that America had abandoned them.
Did they express that to you?
Yes. What they really expressed, and this is what I write, one of the things with Mandel strategies, what I'm trying to help is Americans understand when they deal even economically with the Arab world. They said we were disrespected. Now, if I bring this up, that's how the Saudis felt, that they were disrespected. And if you don't have trust, you can't make relationships. But then I go to the Congress, and the Congress say, look, those are the guys who did 9/11. Those are the guys who did Khashoggi. They have human rights.
Even in the current primary, Republican primary and other candidates, the name of Saudi Arabia is still mentioned in this regard.
You have a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who don't like it. But Saudi Arabia is changing. We need to take advantage of it, one, for the Saudi people on a human rights level to help them move along. But for American national interest, we need to have them back on our side. We need to pull them away from the Chinese. We need to pull them and the Iranians. Basically, that's an axis of resistance. Think of it together as a triad. Russia, China, Iran.
It's already there.
It's there. And they are the reasons why American sanctions don't work as well, because they help that resistance economy of Iran survive so they can continue to persecute their people and expand. Their monies don't go to the Iranian people. Their monies go to Hezbollah and Hamas and for their own
Eric,
benefit. Yeah.
Again, we go back to Iran, but you're mentioning the money. There was a statement made by Secretary Blinken and others that the $6 billion is solely going to be used for humanitarian causes and cannot be used for anything else. How do you take that claim?
Well, they say that it should be used for humanitarian use, and we have strong ways to make that happen. Money is fungible. Anybody who believes that, listen, we know that just as a parallel of what goes on with money is given to the Palestinian Authority.
Right.
Money is fungible here. This money will strengthen their ability to expand their revolution and threaten Israel, threaten American allies. And so the idea to say that it sounds nice, but unless you go below the surface, it's really empty.
Because regardless of what you do, you release some other funds when you put something like this in, even if you do guarantee that it goes for humanitarian causes. You know, we started talking about the future between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned many a time that this is one of his primary goals in establishing these connections between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The word normalization comes up. Minister Ron Dermer, former ambassador of Israel to the US, mentioned a couple of days ago in Israel that Israel might agree to a Saudi nuclear program if normalization is on the horizon. Where do we stand on this, and do you agree with such a potential concession by the Israeli government?
Well, it's a little hypocritical of us to say the Saudis shouldn't have nuclear, because President Obama, what did he do? He gave the world's leading terrorist state the right to enrich uranium, something we never did to any other country. So there's a precedent. So I could understand that. And the Saudis want to protect themselves from Iran.
Especially if there is a perception of an American abandonment of the Middle East.
Exactly.
If I'm on my own, I have to do what I can to defend myself.
Right. So we also have so America has created a joint alliance through CENTCOM of anti-missile coordination between Saudi Arabia, Israel, UAE. So you do have that going on there. But what do the Saudis want? Three things. The Saudis, because they've upped their stakes here, because they're saying, America, you got to come really through for us, because look, you've abandoned the region.
Right.
We want advanced weapons. Mm-hmm. We want close to a NATO security pact, which is not going to fly, because you need a treaty for that, and that won't happen. Biden is speaking actually to Democratic senators now to try to make that happen, and it gets to the point of your nuclear. Should we give that to them? If we can do it with the type of guarantees we give to other countries, where we bring in the low enriched uranium and then we take the spent rods out, if we do the uranium route, there's another one called plutonium, but if we do that and there are tight controls there, not like the horrifically lack of inspections that go on in Iran, then I don't think that is a problem. Because
an inherently deceitful regime, as has been proven so many times.
Right. By the way, if we don't give the Saudis, the Russians will give it to them, the Chinese will give it to them. Better that we do that with the controls that we feel comfortable with, that are there, to make sure. Now, granted, a wildly radical regime, Wahhabi regime, could emerge there. I don't think so. I think the risks can be mitigated. As far as advanced weaponry.
But is that what normalization depends on between Israel and Saudi Arabia?
I think, well, those three things. But the dirty secret in the Middle East is nobody cares about the Palestinians, but there has to be some concessions. They don't trust the Palestinians. They think their monies have been stolen. And so they're really not that interested, but they feel, remember, King Solomon is still alive, the father of MBS.
Right.
He is close to the Palestinian issue. So I believe Israel's going to have to concede something there. Whether that is, as they supposedly want, some areas, give Israel unilaterally give up some areas of Area C, which 60% Israel controls, or stop settlement expansion. There was once a 9-month freeze, 12 years back. Right. To do some of those type of things, to throw a bone to the Saudis, because I tell the Saudis straight out, I said, why are you allowing your interests to be dictated by the Palestinian
intransigence?
They don't really like hearing that, but they know it's true.
Right.
And the truth is, MBS has a vision for the future, his 2030 vision. Israel would be incredibly important for it. So, and he knows the Iranians are going to turn on him sooner or later. So I think that this normalization could happen. They don't like using the word Abraham Accords, which was very interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about
it. And I heard this in Oman and Qatar.
Why?
I think it minimizes it. They don't want to be following the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and joining. They want their own way and path. Who cares? If for American interests, for Israeli interests, regional interests, that they normalize, stabilize the region, come together, work together economically, which is one of the things I want to do, but work together strategically, which they, by the way, these things have been going on. Security, defense, intelligence sharing has been behind the scenes. What you need to have for normalization is openness. And by the way, the openness between the UAE and Israel is a much higher level than between the diplomatic relations Israel has with Jordan and Egypt. Right. And Saudi Arabia, I can see, they would have a much, they want the Israelis to be involved with them if only the Palestinian issue wasn't there. And that's basically how they say it to me.
So to them, the Palestinian issue is the main core that will allow us to move forward. And if that's the case, how do you see the current government in Israel vis-a-vis that issue? Is it more of an impediment to the potential for such normalization?
Yes, I think Bibi has put himself in a real bind here. You know, it's really kind of crazy because this was a brilliant strategist and diplomat, but what he has done has, you know, whether with the judicial reform or whether with the settlement expansion and putting radicals basically who never been accepted to an Israeli government like Smolders and Ben-Gvir that are there, he's hurt American relations and he has hurt the possibility of normalization of what's there. If he was in a unity government, normalization.
So you're saying the perception that the Israeli government is an extremist government, an ultra-right-wing government, has a direct impact on the prospects for normalization. Had it been a national unity government that includes elements on both sides, it would be easier for Saudis to move forward to normalization.
In theory. But you know, sometimes it's like Kissinger going to China.
Right.
When you have the most extreme government, then makes the concessions.
Right.
Then it might be more palatable, but nobody wants to give Bibi a pass, and nobody wants to give Bibi a victory, because normalization is important, but not normalization if it means a pass for America with Iran and letting more nuclear development and more enrichment of Iran for their expansionism. Right. America's trying to tie those two things together. Israel needs to separate them.
So the U.S. is trying to bind Iran nuclear to Saudi normalization.
It's part of the process.
Fascinating to think about all of those interconnections. How do you keep your eyes on the ball in such a complex region? It's not easy, Eric.
It's, you know, I think what I have to have, and I try to have, is humility. That means I very often will strategize with Congress and what to think about, and I'll give them 20 scenarios, and I say, chances are none of these are going to happen, but we're prepared to deal with the 21st one. It's realizing, don't put things in simple templates. Things will change.
Right.
We talked about if we interview again in 2 weeks, how different things could be. So you have to be malleable in your thoughts, open to possibilities. The whole idea, nobody saw the Arab Spring / winter coming. Nobody saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody saw Iran. Right now, MBS and MBK, the head of UAE and the head of Saudi Arabia, they're antagonistic. We didn't see that coming.
Right.
These things change in the Middle East much more, and because we don't have a depth of understanding of the region, we don't know what sense to do and how to advance the interests of ourselves and our allies in the region.
Which is exactly what you're trying to do. So we mentioned Iran, we spoke a little bit about Saudi Arabia, we mentioned nuclear many times. I want to ask you about two other countries in that region, and that's Qatar and Oman. Where do we stand with Qatar and Oman vis-a-vis the US, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and of course, Israel?
So Qatar, and I wrote a piece, I believe it was for the Messenger or the Hill, I'm trying to remember, calling them a frenemy. What are they? When you go to Qatar, and again, I was welcome there, I saw both sides. I saw very welcoming, and I saw some very strong anti-Semitism that was there.
In Qatar?
In Qatar, in Doha, I went to two different think tanks, a good reception in the Brookings Institute, which now has a different name, and a very bad reception in their leading academic institution with meeting with all their PhDs. So it's a place, but when you listen...
What do you mean bad reception?
Not really appreciating the United States, really some blatant anti-Semitism.
Like what?
You know, so it gets to how one defines anti-Semitism. And by the way, I was asked by the American Embassy in Oman, and I'm switching to Oman, last month, to teach what anti-Semitism is in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
And what I told them is that if you say, according to President Biden prioritizing the IHRA definition, that you say Israel does not have a right to exist as a Jewish state, by American standards, that is anti-Semitism. That was a surprise to them.
Right.
Because most people in that world look, especially the ones who try to delegitimize Israel,
Right.
they look at Judaism as a religion. They don't see a national dimension, a civilization dimension, a traditional dimension of being Jewish that has a right through Zionism.
Judea doesn't convince them.
No.
The name. History plays no part.
Well, look at the Palestinians,
Right.
with Arafat and saying
But
that
I'm
you say,
thinking about serious players.
Right.
The Palestinians have made it a principle, in their world to sometimes treat it as if it's a circus. But you're talking about academics that you're meeting with.
in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, to a certain extent, Qatar, they realize what Israel is. They're very upset about what Israel is with what they do with the Palestinians, especially in Qatar. But Qatar considers themselves America's best ally in the region because they host CENTCOM, which is our major player that intertwines the Middle East there in our defense. In Bahrain,
American allies. And yet we hear about the Qataris giving funds to Hamas.
And not other jihadist elements also.
Right.
And so what I asked the Qataris, so you know me, Shahar, I said to them, you're hosting Hamas, you're hosting the Taliban, you're hosting PIJ, what's going on? They said, this is what they told me. The Americans ask us to do that, to talk to the bad guys and use us as intermediaries. We're being used as intermediaries with Iran. The Omanis told me that too. When I went back to Congress, this was a little while ago, they had no idea in Congress that the Biden administration was talking through Oman and Qatar to Iran to create a freeze-for-freeze deal. So there's a lot of things. One of the things I like to do, because I work in the legislative branch mainly, I mainly work in the Senate, is to go there, learn, and create information for American interests and allies' interests in the region that's there. So back to Qatar. So Qatar thinks they're a major friend because they host it there. So I said to the Qataris, you know what? The Emiratis will build us another base. This is a famous base called Al Uaid, and they didn't really like that. They said, we've spent $11 billion here. I said, well, we can use another base there, but they want to be the only player there, so America's indebted to them.
Right.
But for their own interest too. They don't trust the Iranians either. They're Wahhabis. And the Shiites don't like them. So in the long run, even though Qatar is close to Iran, mainly because they share the world's largest gas field with trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars in reserves, they have to work together. But they really, on a deeper level, it's just interest. It's not deep, it's not shared values that are there.
Right.
Oman is a player that could. They say we believe in tolerance. They're not Shiite or Sunni. They're Abadi, and they believe more in tolerance, but they can't take chances on their own. And that's why I talked to the Saudis to give the Omanis cover.
Some sort of an umbrella.
An umbrella to protect them and move that to the next step. And the next steps, which I've written about and I'm working on, is really for the Qataris and the Omanis to reopen the Israeli trade missions that would help their economies and help make the region safer. The Qataris told me, so we have some breaking news, if the Americans asked us, we would reopen it. They claim that they get mixed messages from the Israelis. They claim that they get messages through Derma, the brains of Bibi, to reopen that trade mission. They claim that Mossad, which has almost a diplomatic division, if you will, is not encouraging them to do that. So if you really want, I'm reviewing a book now that people should read. It's called Target Tehran, that's coming out next month, of all of Mossad's activities, both subterfuge and diplomatic and assassinations in conjunction.
Eric, for the sake of our viewers, that rabbit hole, we can't do an interview. We should do a whole series. It's incredible. I mean, even focusing on some of the things you're mentioning here, it's really a great encouragement for us to study and to show more interest in the world around us and the direct effect, like I said before, that it has on our lives on a daily basis and on an individual basis. So I want to take you back for a minute closer to the region. You are also, you work closely with one of our greatest friends in Israel, a think tank up north called Alma, the Alma Education Center. We have Sarit Zehavi often here. I want to ask you about Iran's proxy, Hezbollah. What's the situation on the border? And we've seen things happening there in the last couple of years. Do you see another confrontation looming in the horizon between Israel and, I want to say Lebanon, but I'll say Hezbollah because
Correct.
that is Lebanon.
Okay, so Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, Hezbollah is basically controlled by Iran. They will not start a war without Iranian support. By Walid al-Faqih, which is basically that following the guardianship of the jurists, that they religiously follow. They're a battalion, if you will. So they have seen weakness in Israel, maybe by the judicial reform. Some people theorize that. So they have gone into places called Mount Dov, Ganjar. They have sent a missile there. They've put tents there with Hezbollah armed soldiers there that Israel hasn't really responded. They've been trying to do it diplomatically. They feel empowered of what's going on. That area is hot. So I'm an advisor to Almar. I actually was helping write an article with them yesterday. They are an amazing, amazing place of military. They are the best source of open source intelligence, which is, people don't realize it's maybe more important than Signet and Humint of what's going on. This area has gotten much more volatile. Hezbollah is taking more risks, probably with Iran. Hezbollah controls not only the south, they control the parliament, if you will. It's anarchy there. One of the things I tell Congress is to stop giving $140 million of American taxpayer money to the Lebanese armed forces, which are beholden to Hezbollah, if not helping Hezbollah. So that is a very dangerous area. But when I talk to Israeli policymakers, how they refer to that area, they refer to it as the Iranian border. Why? It's not just Hezbollah, but Hezbollah and Iran are in Syria. And Assad is beholden to them. And so they're right there on the Golan. And they're in Iraq as we circle around. So one of these places goes after another. And as I said before, they're looking at Jordan. Jordan is much more fragile. And Iran is in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. So all of these connect, but Hezbollah is the big proxy, and they are a government within a government that's there, and it is a tense place. And could it ignite? Yes. There are
and
ways,
even in a far more dangerous way because of all of these connections you mentioned. So we're talking about an all-out front war with Israel that comes from different directions into Israel, whether it's Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Even some internal. We hear of internal incitement by Iranian agents within Arab Israelis.
Right, we have heard that, and there are people who listen. There's a whole other show I should come back and we can talk about. I actually did a whole seminar about Arab Israelis, or some call themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel, and have allegiances in different places. It wouldn't be the first time. I don't think that's Israel's primary concern. In fact, Israel, just as an aside, should actually treat the Arab Israeli better to make them feel more Israeli. It's a tough situation, but I think that in the long-term security interest, that is in Israel's interest.
So I'm not going to ask you about the recent statement made by the Israeli Ministry of Finance about potentially cutting some of the financial support to Arab municipalities and academic institutions, or removing potentially the study of Hebrew from some of the education institutions in Israel. Another show. But before we dive into the internal situation in Israel, we have very little time left. So I want to ask you, during your visit in Israel, you can't discuss Israel now without talking about the judicial overhaul. You've met with Moshe Koppel from the Kohelet Forum. You've met with Dan Meridor, one of the prominent voices against the judicial overhaul. In short, give us your take on that entire debate in Israel.
Okay, first of all, the Americans here, my friends, both Americans and American Jews, have very little understanding of Israel. They most didn't realize it didn't have a constitution. And they didn't realize that most people wanted some type of judicial reform. But what it is, the messengers of the judicial reform, first of all, it was not part of the election. And
even though they can claim differently. Like Prime Minister Netanyahu and prominent Likud members claim that was the issue in the campaign in November. But it is what it is.
It is what it is. So the messengers are almost worse than the message. And what they're doing, and they're disrespecting the rest of the country who feel about this. So we'll call it a 50-50 split, but actually the coalition got less than 50% of the vote. And if you're doing something so important Because judicial reform, remember, they think Americans, what do? We compare it to our Supreme Court. It is very different. It's actually much more powerful of what's there. And it could use some restraints. And some of the things, there was low-hanging fruit to do here. But what it does on a grander level, by decreasing Israeli cohesion, national unity, the secret sauce of Israel makes them strong. What makes them what was the fourth happiest country in the world was because they had a common purpose, meaning of life. This has destroyed it. That's why it's not unfair for President Biden to say, I'm worried about Israeli national unity, because that affects American national security interests. And a center-right think tank that I work with, JISS, people like Ephraim Inbar and Iran Leaman and Yaakov Amadror, they were all saying this political debate is endangering Israel's security, both within and without the perception, and we don't need this. This is a very dangerous time for Israel. So the judicial debate here, on a bigger scale, needs to be paused for no other reasons for how what Israel does with Iran and Saudi Arabia and Hezbollah and Hamas and the PA. So I think it is taking advantage, and it's really dangerous for Israel. And so I think the specifics we can do another time, but it needs to be paused. And there are people now in the coalition that also think it needs to be paused after the reasonableness bill. You've taken too much at this point. But if they keep pushing it, there's a real danger, an internal domestic danger for Israel.
Recently when I visited Israel, I had an enlightening conversation with Professor Yuval Elbashan, who is one of the prominent voices in Israel, who works for compromise, works with both sides. By the way, he's a lefty academic social activist who is working hand in hand with his good friend Yariv Levin, the Minister of Justice, trying to bring the two sides together. One of the things he told me was that the judicial overhaul touches the very core of Israeli society in social elements that have always been there under the surface and have now resurfaced under the auspices of this judicial overhaul. But what you're telling me here is that all of these internal issues have a direct impact on Israel-US relations and on Israeli security, especially in such a super volatile time for the Israeli state looking around us.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. That anybody who's trying to separate this is like people think it's a domestic issue. Yes, it is a domestic issue. But if you're not looking at the repercussions with the U.S.-Israel relationship, then you're blind, and you're not doing Israel justice for its security, or if you're an American, for American national security. So that's a very important point, that these things are definitely tied in.
So we started by you telling us, breaking the news that you've launched Mandel Strategies. We've known you to be active in this sphere for many years with a lot of expertise, many trips in the region to places known and unknown. Speaking with and enriching public discourse, but also elected officials in directing policy in the right way, trying to put the American interests on the table. If people want to continue this conversation and want to learn more about so much that you're doing, what website, where should they go to be able to nourish their understanding of the world by following your journey?
So there are two websites I have. There's Mandel Strategies, mandelstrategies.com, and there's MEPINanalysis.org. So if you want my published articles and individual analysis of the region, it's MEPINanalysis.org. But if you are somebody who believes that economics and shared interests are the way for peace in the region, and I am, then go to Mandel Strategies. And if there are people that I can help, I want, one of the things that happens, and I remember I had a French friend who came and did business in America, and he told me he would say things and the Americans go, yes, 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 and it really meant get the hell out, and he didn't get it. Right. One of the things I want to do is to translate people who speak English from the Middle East, Israel included, to the United States, who want to invest with one another, maybe governments talking one to another. I'm an American. I care about American national security interests. This is one of the best ways to advance it. So mandelstrategies.com, please reach out to me. And I do always respond, and whether or from MEPIN analysis. Please, if I have one last message to give everybody, is don't listen to the talking points. Read beyond what you normally read. Everything is editorialized. Go a little deeper. because that's the way you're going to know. And then try, when you get a little more, that things are not black and white, it's not binary, it's gray.
Right.
And when things are gray, it's not 50-50, it could be 95-5, but you need to understand, and you also have to have respect of the other. It's a very Jewish value.
Right.
Protecting the minority also, is something based upon, we look at a Chumash, our Bible, of what is, we have Jewish values also of what we do there. And many of those Jewish values, the Judeo-Christian values of America, are things we should put as part of our foreign policy in dealing with respect in the Islamic world.
Including a progressive talking points beyond the political divisions in the US. Why are you giving $6 billion to a regime that's raping, killing, and murdering its own future generation? A very simple question that doesn't require too much of geopolitical analysis, but only requires a heart, doesn't it, Eric?
And what you've done is inspired me to start writing again about the Iranian protesters, and it's because I try to keep it on the map. The ones even the activists here are getting a little fatigued,
right,
in between this. But we have to keep. The Americans don't understand what is happening to the Iranian people. They would be appalled. And our media is not doing justice. Again,
right,
we'll give them, because of Ukraine, because of China, but they really need to know about those human rights issues there, and how how if we do change things there, that we can advance our interests.
Because Eric, if more people knew about those things and were aware of it and it was properly covered, then that question, that very simple question that both of us pose, would be presented by every civilian to their representative in Congress and asking this very simple question. Why is this happening? Why are we empowering a murderous regime?
Listen, the executive branch, whether it's Democratic or Republican, always believes they should control foreign policy and have Congress be a rubber stamp. What I do, part of my job, is to get the Senate and the House people to realize you have a constitutional responsibility to challenge the executive branch when they do things like this, not based upon politics, but based upon American interests.
Eric, I told you from the very outset, I could go for hours with you learning so much from your travels, from your vast expertise, and I encourage you, our viewers, to follow Eric's journeys, to understand more, whether through MEPIN or Mandel strategies, to be a smarter engagers with the world around us, because it will make life so much better, not just for us, but for everyone around us. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining me today and for enlightening us with these incredible insights about the region, the world, and truly about ourselves.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, you know, the Middle East is a quagmire, the Middle East is a world unto its own, and Eric is here to enlighten the path for us. I'd like to thank Eric for all that he does for the US, Israel, and for the Jewish people, and I'm sure that we've all grown a little more confused, but much smarter after listening to this enlightening conversation with Dr. Eric Mandel. I'd like to thank you all for watching and for taking this important path with JBS to learning more about the world around us. Looking forward to seeing you all next time as we cast yet another fascinating eye on Israel and the world. Thank you all for watching, and see you soon.